So our first speaker is David Hodge from the University of Glasgow, who has been doing lots with Quarto and is going to share the kind of templates he's developed and some of the thinking behind that.
All right, super. Okay, because I'm going to probably show you a couple of things where I'll jump out of the slides at some point, I'll stick myself a little bit to the center here so that I can click on things. So title's already there. Let me just give it a little intro. So I am somebody who's worked with Quarto, R Markdown, R stuff for the last 10-ish years. I'm not anyone who works for Posit, who's the company who made our studio and stuff like that. But I have worked with it for a long time, and hopefully I'm kind of an expert practitioner. There's quite a few people around here, I think, in this room who also have worked with it. So hopefully in this afternoon, in the hands-on session, there's also other people milling around who can also help out. So back a second to me. I'm just David Hodge here. I work at University of Glasgow. I've been developing some Quarto templates and doing talks about accessibility in Quarto for a little while. So I thought I'd try and pull things together. I've got two halves to my talk. The first half is a little bit of an intro to what Quarto is and maybe explaining what it was designed for and what you might therefore use it for. And maybe you might identify whether it's useful for your use cases. And the second half is kind of like my tips, where I'll say, this is my ideas for how I've managed to get around certain issues with accessibility. There may be better ones that someone will tell you about later, but they do work and do nice things. So quick intro, it's an open source publishing system. That means you write text and magically it spews out files that you'd like at the other end. It's in Markdown, which is a text-based language that's easily readable by humans. It's quite like tech in the sense that it's a text file where you write stuff, and if you know what LaTeX is and tech is, but it's not tech, PowerPoint, or Word, basically. It's you write text in a text file, you throw it into Quarto, it does some fancy work, and it spews out the sort of file you've asked for at the other end. I say it's just closest to tech in that sense because you're writing text, but you haven't got to write lots of backslashes and semi-open squiggly brackets and closed squiggly brackets and stuff like that. Okay, so it began probably R programming language, R studio, the company, and then R Markdown is what they created. It's no longer just for R. Nowadays, Python, Julia, Observable.js are all languages that are also supported by Quarto. And they're trying to target anyone who works with those languages or anyone that wants to make nice notes and things like that anyway. So the desire originally was the ability to include code and reproducible content inside documents. So for reproducibility purposes. But nowadays, this modern standalone version of Quarto, you can download Quarto and not have any software to actually edit your files in, and you can just run Quarto, like Quarto run it on my file. You probably don't want to. You probably want to download something like RStudio or Positron or Jupyter Lab, which gives you a nice interface for editing your files. Okay, so a quick schematic. I borrowed this from a nice talk from a couple of years ago. You write stuff on the left. You can not bother with programming languages. You can just write text and just write mathsy stuff. You can feed it into Quarto, and then you can get out the other end PDFs, HTMLs, Word documents if you want to. I'll talk particularly today about HTMLs, the main one we'll kind of want to do if we want to do accessible outputs. There's loads of lovely documentation. It's been around for, again, like 10. Quarto is probably more like 4 or 5 years, but the R Markdown and the RStudio environment, much longer than that. So there's a lovely website there. These slides themselves were made in Quarto, and you write things like this if you want to make a hyperlink. You haven't got to do anything, you can just write that and it will do a hyperlink for you. Also at the website, I'll mention it later, I highly recommend, let's just make it slightly larger, going and looking around the gallery. You can see loads of examples of nice sites that people have made with Quarto. So you can do single one-off things like articles. This is more for academic-y article-y things. Presentations like the ones I'm talking about now. And then most of the ones you'll probably be interested in are what they call websites, which is basically multi-page documents where you can click between them or have one large page and just have lots of content on it. So if I just open, oh, they've changed what the default ones look like. Let me find one. Oh, yes. So there's websites and there's technically books, which are also basically interlinked websites, so they're the same thing. If I open one, for example, here's an example of one. This is some software in Python. This is the documentation for it. Again, let me make that slightly larger for those at home. And essentially, it's a web page. Most of this content around the outside, Quarto will put there for you. So a nice table of contents, links to different pages. You just have to write the core content in the middle. And we can have a look. Accessibility purposes, this is HTML. I'll talk a little bit later about what HTML provides us. Probably a lot of you already know that if I can get something into HTML, we've already got over a large number of the problems with accessibility, particularly around PDFs in the past. I can turn on my favorite web plugin to see how well is this page doing for accessibility purposes on some superficial points. And interestingly, there are some contrast errors. I'll mention this later. And there are some, this says there's a problem with a missing alternative text on the image. That's just the logo in the corner, so that's actually not a serious issue. So this page is pretty good. There are some funny issues, like you probably notice, where is it? Where can I see it here? If I was to go into one of these chapters, something's a bit strange. These are the things that are failing contrast checks. The default behavior, annoyingly, of certain things are sometimes failing these checks. Okay. So there's loads of excellent blogs as well. Let me just come back to the other screen a second. Oops. Ooh, am I standing in the wrong place? Okay, that's fine. And there's many people who've done nice things. Particularly, I keep on stumbling across lovely work by Mina around accessibility in Quarto. So nowadays, Posit, which used to be called RStudio, they make software. Again, this is all free stuff. RStudio and Positron are nice editors for editing Quarto files. You can run it standalone. If you're a Python-y person, if you like VS Code or Jupyter Code, Jupyter for writing text files, you can do that already. Again, technical programming things, it doesn't matter. Download any of these things typically, and you can just, what they all give you is a button in them where you write your content, and you can click a button that says, make my book, make my document. If you don't do it in one of these kinds of things, then you've got to do a little bit more stuff in terms of work in the background. Okay. So what are we trying to do? So you can make a load of different formats. One of the powerful things about Markdown is that you're writing just the content in text file. And at the moment, you can make HTMLs, PDFs, Word documents. Maybe in the future, you make something else because someone else there'll be something better to use. But your content is just raw content. You haven't got to worry about all the annoying syntax and too much structural things. So what are we going to care about? I've stolen Lillian's words here. What we really care for accessibility typically is something that's machine readable. The output we're going to give to people to use and read, hopefully a computer can read it in an easy way so that if they've got external software they want to use, they've got their own things they want to do, like change certain colors, they want to change the size of things, they want to change the screen size. If it's in a nice machine readable format, then when we give it to somebody, they can customize it themselves. If I give them a PDF that's been created by LaTeX, they can't do nice things to it. If I give them HTML made by Quarto, they can change the font, the sizes, the colors, and all that kind of stuff. I think people this morning in all the talks will talk about the power of having things in HTML, so I'll try not to say too much and steal too many people's thunder. So what do we care about in terms of output? HTML, definitely. PDFs, maybe. You may want to provide PDF just so students can have a standalone file that they can save on the computer and use. Word documents, again, maybe. It can spew them out. There's certain issues with trying to keep up with however Microsoft currently does accessibility inside Word and trying to spew into that, especially around tables, I would say. Reveal.js is just a fancy name for the presentations, which are HTMLs, which is what this is. And there's other formats available as well, which typically you're not going to bother with because you've already got nice ones available. So the real hard work is actually not done by Quarto. It's done by a project called Pandoc, which can convert a file with nice content into actually probably tens, if not 100 different types of output formats. Most of the time, people are doing HTML. Not all the things you create using Pandoc, using Quarto, are magically beautifully accessible to start with. That's the bad news. But hopefully I'll try and today talk about how you can get around some of those problems. So you make a file in Quarto nowadays. They're called Quarto Markdown files. That's what QMD stands for. This middle bit is that previous image now expanded out. Same speakers I've stolen this from. So this bit here, Quarto takes your files, runs some code on it to convert it into some intermediate file, and then it feeds it into Pandoc, which then spews out the answer. You don't need to do anything other than write this file, and then you feed it into Quarto. It does the middle bit, and it spits out whatever you've asked it for. Okay, so what do you want? So having talked about formats, you still need to care about what your actual content is. So what is my content going to be? Well, single page worksheets are pretty easy and nice and straightforward. If you just want a single page Nice thing about HTML is the page, you don't have to worry about where the page breaks. You just make one page and the users can scroll through them, basically. Multi-page websites, I'll call them here, like books, lecture notes, things for a course that have got interlinks between them. Mini books, I just described them. Sometimes you have like just one chapter of a set of notes and you provide separate chapters one at a time. Presentation lecture slides. Those of you from the LaTeX world may be used to things like Beamer and things like that. This is a nice modern HTML slide deck where you can do fancy things. So for those people working or having come from the past in terms of LaTeX PDF things, most of these things historically for students, we provide them PDFs having run through LaTeX or done it in Word because that's what we had available to us and then given that to students. In the last 10 years now, an easy way to make HTMLs has become available, and that's what Quarto is one of the ways of doing that. So as I mentioned before, Quarto World has some silly names for things. It calls things books and websites, which are really the same thing, which is interconnected collections of HTML pages. And then presentations are different because the way in which the background gubbins kind of works is more complicated to do presentations. So it's a different sort of object. You can do all kinds of other things with Quarto, but today I'll just talk about primarily things that are interconnected web pagey things. All right. So hopefully I get onto accessibility nice and quickly. So what am I talking about? Again, I'm reminding myself, I'm thinking about making HTMLs typically that are machine readable in some way, whatever that means. The key thing is I want the browser to be able to display it for the user, and then the user can customize it however they want. Now, some of the tools you'll see today might contain some lovely things already built in from that point of view. Quarto is not built from the beginning with accessibility as the desire. It wasn't, in that sense, it's not the perfect tool. It wasn't designed like that. They are adding more and more things as they go along, and people in this room probably have added that community in helping Quarto make sure that if there are things that need adding, the thing is they can be added and they are being added actively. So more generally, I care about making files that are readable in some way so that my students can take the HTMLs I give them, and then they've got their own software which they may run on top of their browser or in their browser, and they can do whatever they want. That may mean changing size of things, changing fonts, colors, all that kind of stuff. By making it into HTML through Quarto, you give the users the full control of how they want to see stuff and interact with it. Okay, so little thing here. Probably everyone's here for an accessible maths workshop, so they kind of already know what lots of these things are, so I'm not going to go over all these details. There may be some overlap with other people in a minute. I'll talk about some of those things which you're interested in trying to do and tell you how easy or difficult they are in Quarto. So things like responsiveness, things like structure and heading things like colors, navigation. I may not say much about use of language. Okay, so for getting started, for when you do hands-on stuff later, I didn't want to show too many hands-on things at the moment because it's better to learn things hands-on by actually having your hands free and actually doing things. To get started with Quarto, the main thing is you need to install Quarto and something to type your text files into. So you will install R or Python just because that engine drives some of the things in the background. And then you'll install your integrated development environment, the IDE thing, which is the interface where you will be able to type your content, and it will give you nice things like shortcuts and buttons that say, build this, show me a preview, all that kind of stuff. Typically, people recommend RStudio and Positron. If you've already worked with JupyterLab, totally use that. It's already in there as well. No, I won't tell you. No one wants to be told to do the bottom thing. So examples. When you open RStudio or you open Positron or you open any of these things, you can launch a default template. And it'll give you a fairly plain template, which doesn't really get you started with accessibility, certainly. And it doesn't really show you what the full range of things you can do in Quarto are. So I typically don't recommend people just start with a completely blank template and they just stare at a screen, not sure where to get started. Go and look at some examples of some templates that are not completely blank, that contain some nice examples of things. Tom is hiding over there. Sorry, Tom, I'm going to name check you. He gave a lovely workshop recently to the Scottish Maths Support Network on Quarto. And I've put links here to both his workshop and the slides. He'll probably talk about this afternoon as well, or something like this. So please go. There's some nice starter templates there that are, in a sense, better than the default ones you get because they don't really show you what to do to get started. But there are millions of these lovely things online. I will show you just briefly at the second. For my colleagues in Glasgow, I've recently pulled together this blank template, not that blank. This was like a set of notes with a book template, which I put some chapters to explain to staff how to do certain things around headings and things like that in Quarto. So this page talks about headings. This shows the staff how to do these things are called call-out boxes. If you want to have for demarking sections of text, help students identify where does this theorem begin, where does this theorem end, stuff like that. In LaTeX, that's actually typically quite poor in that, like, you just have just this theorem and you can't always tell where this theorem ends. Loads of people nowadays typically love putting colored boxes in to try and identify where important sections are. Lovely, as long as the colors you choose are sensibly chosen. There are default boxes in Quarto. I don't like them personally very much. I'll mention some other ones in a minute. There's a green one on this screen. It's quite hard to even see. All right, so I'll come back to this later anyway, so I'll just show you this. So this is a typical example. This looks a bit like that thing I showed you earlier. I've got pages like this. I can navigate between the pages. If I just jump to chapter X, this is like a full set of notes, one chapter for my lecture notes I was giving this semester. And this uses slightly different color boxes. In fact, it's the same ones I think Tom loves, which I'll mention later. And there's all kinds of other things in here that I'll come back to later. So the main thing is Quarto gives you most of this. This isn't zero work to make this, but these templates that I've made, I've shared online, and I may show them to you a little bit later on, but certainly this afternoon. So what are our concerns? Quarto is fantastic. You can customize everything. Good news. Bad news is that Quarto is customizable and you can customize everything. And that means you can do things that immediately make things inaccessible. So unless you're kind of keeping an eye on what it is you're trying to do, which is not just make something that you think looks snazzy, but actually is available to everyone and they can all use all the things, you really do need to think about that. So it's lovely, but it's bad because you can customize everything. Not every feature out of the box is exactly how you'd like it to be in terms of accessibility. A lot of things are, but I'll talk about what things aren't and what things are in a moment. Okay, oops, I've lost my screen. Occasionally, pretty rare, if you do something that's too funky, you need to check whether Firefox and Chrome, and it's typically not required nowadays, mostly. Most of the things in Quarto seem to work very nicely across all the browsers. But that's only if you're starting to add on extra fancy features. So what's the good stuff? Images, alt text, easy to add. There's a couple of ways of doing it, typically depending on how the image was created. If you're creating images kind of in your code on the fly, making like R to make a plot, you haven't made the plot and saved it as a picture already, then you do it slightly differently to if you just hyperlink to an image. Structure, you can have headings, different levels, encouraging good behaviors of having top level headings, next level down, stuff like that. Videos, multiple ways of doing that. I think people may this afternoon talk about other ways of doing embedding interactive things. There's multiple ways of doing most things in Quarto because it wasn't designed as a you must do one thing. You're trying to target an HTML file. There's lots of ways of making HTML files show videos. I'll talk a little bit about the options there, especially around accessibility. Plugins, there's a load of, on the Quarto website, list of plugins that people have made. You can make one if you want to, which adds extra functionality. And particularly around slides, this is actually one of the main contributors. This is somebody's name here. Contributions. This is someone who's contributed quite a lot to the Quarto project and is working actively improving Quarto. They made an add-on for accessibility for presentation slides, like the slides I'm talking about here. And I'll show you that little snazzy thing in a little bit later. There aren't that many accessibility-based extension things, but I think, again, typically what happens is if something is important, someone will have created something for it, they'll make it available at some point, and then it will get incorporated into the base Quarto in the future. That's how it tends to work. And here, for example, this will almost certainly be embedded in the future because this is created also by someone who works actively on developing Quarto. The responsiveness, some of that means opening it on a smaller screen, on a phone that's landscape, on a phone that's portrait. How do all these things cope? Pretty well. So Quarto basically is using something called Bootstrap in terms of it's an HTML way of doing stuff, and that automatically resizes things and does nice stuff. I'll show it to you when I show you examples later. Things like on a wide screen, it puts loads of things like a menu and a table of contents. When it gets narrower, table of contents gets hidden because you haven't got enough width so that the content takes up the main stuff. Math jacks will be talked about a lot today. I'll come back to that in a minute. That's just, you can type LaTeX code for how to do equations, and HTML will display it on the screen. That's my short version. Longer versions will appear today. Code is not that important for accessibility. Typically, if you want to include code in your, most people may not care about including code-based things inside their notes and things they're giving out to students. If you aren't, it doesn't matter. If you are, there are nice ways of embedding code things which are accessible, basically. And finally, browser plugins, I may talk about that a little bit. I showed you already a minute ago my favorite one for just quickly checking how bad my document is. There are other nice ones that do useful things, not just for us creating content, but for those using it. I said students may have their own ones they like using anyway, but up here already, I've got a couple I'll show you later maybe of plugins that do basic things like change the background immediately to another color, change the font immediately, change the size of things. Just easy, 10 seconds, you can download the add-on, plug it in, turn it on, and see how you can customize an HTML page. Okay, how am I doing for time? All right. So that was the good stuff. The more difficult stuff, people love to still try and create HTMLs and PDFs at the same time. You can in Quarto. It's a bit more painful. There's certain things you have to be very careful of. One is that if you try and do any nice features like videos, obviously PDFs don't have those things embedded typically, so be careful. There aren't universal feature overlaps. Color naming is a real weird one. The names that Quarto, if you use colors, make sure you probably use hex codes, because the names that HTML has for colors and the names that LaTeX calls colors are not the same colors always. The word olive might mean two different colors to LaTeX and to HTML, so it's better to name them, not to name them. Layout control, if you try and do PDFs as well, again, you don't manually, if you used to do LaTeX stuff, you wrote loads of fancy things to make it look right. If you're just focusing on the Quarto HTML, it won't be perfectly aligned. Mostly people care about, LaTeX macros. Again, if you do make PDFs and LaTeX from the same root, from Quarto, it basically creates an HTML one way and then goes and runs LaTeX in the background and creates a PDF the other way. You need to tell it about the LaTeX macros in two places. There's about 10 ways of doing this. I've got my own way. I think Tom's got his own way. Most problems, people who are starting out with Quarto trying to share things with students, the main difference when you start with HTML is that suddenly you've got to give students maybe not just one HTML page, but also like a folder with all the images in, because you haven't embedded all the content in one document. A PDF is a fully embedded single document you share with students. And HTML is typically a folder with content in different files that are hyperlinked. If you're in Canvas, Blackboard, Moodle, your own VLE, there is a way of doing that. But it'll be a first new thing you learn if you try and move into the HTML world there. You'll zip it up, upload a zip, and unzip it automatically on the server, and magically it'll just work. So, fab. So I've talked a lot about the kind of background stuff. I'll go quickly through some of the tips again. Most of these things I'll be very happy kind of in the workshop later. Hopefully it's not just me milling around later, but there's other people also with Quarto expertise will be here. And I'll kind of can show you more detail some of the things I'm about to show you. So main thing is, I promise this is, well, I promise this is not the best. I can also can't promise this is not. So this is good advice, hopefully, for dealing with certain issues around accessibility through Quarto. So I'll try and move on quickly from PDF again. You can bypass PDF entirely. You can decide, if I really want to give a PDF to students, make a lovely HTML, open it in typically Chrome, and then print a PDF, and it's pretty damn good. You want to just provide a PDF that looks like your HTML. If you do try and use Quarto to make PDFs and LaTeX, some of the built-in templates, like the one I've shared from the Glasgow University one, does do Quarto by default with HTML and PDF at the same time. It looks great. If you do that, then there's certain things you have to be careful of. The way you do tables, it's easy to do them. There's 10 ways of doing tables. 2 of them work nicely in terms of making the HTML and PDF accessible. If you output to docx, the same thing happens. Unless you use a particular one of the table types, the header row doesn't get labeled as a header row by Word, for example. The way you do alt text, there's a lot of choice. There's a lot of weird terminology in the alt text world. When you've got a picture, you can have like a caption, you can have a title, which is a thing when you hover over it with the mouse, to have all these different names, to give different words to different parts of how you look at accessible images. Actually, there's only one way to do it nicely so that you can name all these things separately, but typically you only care about 1 or 2 things. It doesn't really matter. If you really want to do this again, just warn you that you'll probably need some LaTeX knowledge in order to debug LaTeX issues. Plugins and shortcodes. This is just some extra things that lay on the top of the standard Quarto to do fancy things. The colored boxes I showed you a minute ago that were collapsible and numberable and referenceable and nice. These are made by a nice academic in Germany. There's a link to them there. That's embedded in my templates. I think Tom includes it in his templates. Shortcuts are just shortcuts for certain things, typically not to do with accessibility, except videos, which I'll mention in a minute. I'll come back to the ally at the top there. I'll do that first, actually. If I come to the screen, hopefully this works on my screen. If you're at home following along, just press A and you're watching the slides. You'll get a menu pop out on the right. This is just a plugin that somebody made and made available to allow users who are viewing a presentation that came out of Quarto to customize various things. So I can quickly just change the font. If I want a sans font here, if I want to change the line spacing to make it a bit wider or narrower, all these things I can quickly change. These are the sorts of things that someone may already have their own way of doing this anyway, but there are things like these plugins available to give users more customizability in the presentations. So let me turn that back off and come back to here. Oops. So that's pressing A inside a presentation. That's a plugin for presentations. Finally, again, given the list of things that people are talking about today, there'll probably be some overlap with what I'm talking about here. Typically, things that are external. The one thing that HTML gives you is the power to embed other things which are living somewhere else. So numbers, YouTube videos and things like that. If you've got something elsewhere that works nicely on the web, you can just plug it in and hide it inside a Quarto page. How you do that, iframes is the old kind of typical way. I found some of the things weren't super accessible, the way that iframes worked, depending on what thing you were trying to embed. I made a little plugin myself that's inside my template that adds certain things so that you can, I'll talk about that probably in a minute anyway. So MathJax, people will talk about this today. Main thing in Quarto is that there's a default MathJax that's loaded. That may not be the default MathJax that you want. If you know about different versions of MathJax, there's a brand new version which has got a nicer accessibility menu. You may need to add this text to your Quarto files to say, go and load the newest version. At some point, Quarto will change this to be the default, and then you won't need to worry about that anymore. People will probably see that later today. Videos, for accessibility purposes, the main thing I would suggest is you just embed the video somewhere else. That somewhere else might be a private YouTube video where you can get auto transcription and all the text already done for you. The main thing is you can link it in. You can add fancy kind of ARIA labels if you want to inside Quarto. Main thing is I recommend hosting it somewhere else and linking it in. There may be better ways of doing this. I won't talk too much about videos. Tiny preview. This is just, I haven't shown you much. This is what a slide looks like. This is what the output will look like. Some bullet points, some headers, and some equations and words. And this is the markdown file you write. You write plus for, you don't have to write begin itemized, blah, blah, blah. You just put pluses, and that's how you get lists. You can choose heading levels and maths equations, stuff like that. I won't say too much about that for now. Responsiveness, so a wide screen, a medium width screen, a narrow screen, all the same page. This is some lecture notes from my course this year. You'll see, oh, that didn't change. Okay, that's because I'm doing the presentation version. Let me just jump to here. Here, narrow, medium, and wide. These things like the menus at the top, once you've done a little bit of work to begin with, Quarto just makes it automatically responsive. So things will disappear. This menu appears to begin with in the wide version and disappears into the menu at the top in the shorter version. And then the even narrower version, you can make everything disappear, all that kind of stuff. One thing you'll see, I just had a problem over there. I wanted to try and tab. Should I let that person in? Why not? I don't have the power. Maybe I do. Welcome. One thing I had problems there was I was trying to tab between these things, and it didn't work absolutely perfectly. It actually works differently in the presentations and in books. I'll mention that on this page. So navigation, Quarto is typically okay with some issues. What I mean is, if I'm trying to navigate through a page, via tabbing, does it actually let me get through and see all the elements that are really important? Let me just show you a typical thing. So in Quarto here is the built-in way that Quarto does. Where's it gone? Oh, chapter 1, no, chapter 2. There we go. So here, oh, that's the wrong one. Let me try in chapter 1. Here's the built-in way that Quarto here, on the right here, on the left, sorry, does multi-tab things. And here's some R code, and here's some Python code. And the annoying thing is, if I try and press tab, it depends on the browser. Sometimes that's perfect. Sometimes you end up in the Python one. Can I press left and right to get to the R? I can today. Yesterday I couldn't. I've made extra add-ons and things that make this work more nicely all the time. So I just click here. This is my own version of this. And you get like a well highlighted object here, and you move between these things. In Quarto by default, if you've got code, this is hidden. So if you try and tab through a page, when you tab to the copy button, you've got no idea you're on a copy button because it doesn't say you're on a copy button, and it's all well hidden away. Okay, I've gone into the program, so it's annoying. I'm gonna have to go back. Okay, so that's navigation stuff. It's typically fine, but you want to be careful about checking things. Callouts I mentioned already, color boxes. These are the default ones. If you mess with the colors and default ones, you can change them. That's fine, but be really careful. Be really careful that in Quarto, in the dark modes that are made available to you, which is lovely, unless you're actually on a black background, some of the default colors in the dark mode aren't high contrast. So if you have a slightly off black background, you have contrast issues. And finally, I'm just going to show you, if you're doing R plots, things like this, if it's some code to make a plot, the main difference, all that's changed if you used to work with any R Markdown things, is you just have to add something like fig alt here to say I want this image to have alt text, and then everything looks the same. In the background, it's as easy in your world of just adding this kind of text in the right place. Okay, I think I won't go into this one. I'll put it in the slides here. This is the one I love for quickly checking. You can turn on alt text to check everything's been alt texted. These are the ones that allow you to do things like change all the colors, change all the font sizes. That's external to Quarto. These are just bonus things I'd recommend checking when you're with your Quarto outputs to see how well people who are trying to customize your HTMLs can manage it. Okay. And then I will stop there. So this is my end of my little tour. Hopefully I've shown you some things that are useful. Mostly have a hands-on go later, and I will stop talking. Okay.
We have maybe time for one question if we have.
No, basically that's default behavior of Quarto. If you have like a book, it will by default on widescreen show you a nice table of contents on one side, which you can turn on or off if you wish to. But if you then make the screen narrower, as it gets narrower, beyond a certain point, it will automatically start hiding things for you. Does that answer the question? Not quite. How to see the view? Oh, you mean, oh, I think maybe just see the view. If you want to see what it looks like, so in any browser, you can just change the size of the window to automatically get to pretend you're on a phone. You can also go into the fancy menus somewhere and say, I want to pretend I'm on an iPhone, and it will give you the options. That's called responsiveness check inside. You can press F11. There's probably someone else talking about other things today that I'm sure will overlap anyway. But yeah, you can turn on the responsive menu in any browser and pretend to be any kind of device and any kind of screen size to check how it's working. But typically it's really good. The default templates are really good from that point of view.
Okay, thank you, David, very much. There'll be more Quarto stuff this afternoon, so you can have a play with that then.